These days, you don't have to look far to see the struggles over history are still happening. From Florida's book and teaching bans up to Supreme Court decisions, the way we shape our stories of the past have a profound impact on the decisions made in the present. Because if they can erase the ills of slavery, which is bad enough, opponents of history can also justify what happens in the present. Writers in the African American literary tradition have been writing historical wrongs for what must be centuries. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, a few fiction writers have found new ways to address America's ruptures with the past. And this is going to be the subject of our video today. This idea may seem counterintuitive, but stick with me. This video's collection of authors will show us that fiction can compose a more reliable narrative than has been written in the past. We'll discuss up to 6 classic books that rewrite the gaps in America's accounts of slavery. But more than just historical fiction, these books focus specifically on the modern American consciousness of their respective eras. You'll recognize some of these books, but a few others may be completely new. Quick note, during the making of this video, I remembered 2 books that might also work well in this episode. James by Percival Everett and Burn Down Master's House by Clay Kane. That last one is pretty new. They didn't make it in this video, so I might want to do another video on those 2 books in the future. Both are pretty recent publications, which shows the enduring legacy of modern enslaved narratives. I've read James, and it's a fantastic book. It's a rewrite of Huckleberry Finn from Jim's perspective. I've not read the other book by Clay Kane, but it's been on my shelves for a while now, even though it is pretty new, and I do plan on reading it. An episode of the Black Lit Geek with Brett, he said it was a page turner, so it's probably worth a pickup. Many people know the most famous example from this body of literature, Beloved, made its rounds in the book clubs, on the best of lists, on book channels like this, and of course on celebrity talk shows ad nauseum. But Toni Morrison won't be the focus of this video today because many people have already talked about her book. Although we will have to talk about her impact on the rest of this body of books. So we'll mention her very briefly. Instead, this video is going to examine the connections between 5 other books in Beloved's orbit. And we'll examine how their radical perspectives on the history of slavery both connect history to now and re-envision it for more accurate representations. This body of literature is called by various names: postmodern slave narrative, neo-slave narrative, and simply historical fiction. If you feel any of those names don't quite do these books justice, don't worry, scholars are still debating what to call this literature. And they will probably be debating for a while as we do. First up, scholar Bernard Bell was the first to observe connections between this body of novels we're going to discuss today. He not only observed slavery, but also examined how it was being perceived in the modern world. These authors saw an opportunity to rewrite existing history to more accurately represent memory and experience from the period. About a decade after Bernard Bell, another scholar named Ashraf H.A. Rushdie wrote a book that codified a phenomenon in literature he called neo-slave narrative. That book was published about 1999. I'll be straight with you. There are some not so great books in this genre. Two of the most infamous examples are Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell and The Confessions of Nat Turner by William Styron. We're not going to focus on those today. But here's some trivia. Lest you doubt their relevance today, first, both books won Pulitzer Prizes. Gone with the Wind won a Pulitzer in 1937, and as a movie, it won an Academy Award in 1939. The Confessions of Nat Turner won the Pulitzer in 1968. While its relevance has faded, Styron's book has solidified familiar tropes that are still in operation today. Here's one more detail. Are you ready? In a 2014 Harris poll, Americans noted Gone with the Wind as their second most favorite book in the country, second only to the Bible. It beat out Harry Potter. Now, favorite book? I understand keeping it alive as a historical artifact, lest we forget it, lest we forget the lessons from that era. But favorite book? That one was interesting. But Gone with the Wind and The Confessions of Nat Turner have prompted strong responses from literature's most underrated books. So, we're going to spend the majority of our time on these Black authors and look at what they have to say about history and memory. Many books I'll mention were published before Beloved, and Toni Morrison listed a few of them as influences on her work. But because Beloved has such a big orbit, I'll give you a 2-minute overview so that we have it on record for this video. All of my book overviews in this video will be spoiler-free. Beloved begins as a ghost story, but persists as a haunting. Setha, a mother, and her daughter Denver live with a ghost in their place called Sweet Home. Paul D., a man from Setha's past on the plantation, arrives and he briefly drives away the spirit. But soon, a mysterious guest arrives who calls herself Beloved. Beloved forces Setha to reconcile with a traumatic past in slavery. But others in the area worry the suffering may keep Setha locked in its memory unless they intervene. And that's where I'll stop the summary, because any more than that is going to give a lot of weight in it, just in case there are some people who haven't read that book. Morrison eventually won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is not a single book award, but Beloved is largely believed to be a major reason for that award. It remains her most popular book, although Song of Solomon has recently seen a resurgence of acclaim. As we go through our 5 other books, you may be able to see how Morrison was influenced and how she influences others, particularly on the subject of memory and history. Because of this body of literature and Beloved as its main star, these novels also show us another significant concept. They demonstrate how the African American literary tradition is more than a list. It's actually a conversation, and that's one of the great ways to look at it. This video's roster provides us with some strong instances of this conversation, and we're going to go in chronological order, which means the first book up is Margaret Walker's Jubilee, published in 1966. The novel was a direct response to Gone with the Wind because it parallels former enslaved people's lives with their white, romanticized counterparts. But Mitchell's novel shouldn't be our lens for this book. The gist of Jubilee's story is this. It's an epic tale of more than 500 pages that takes readers from slavery through civil war and into Reconstruction, when newly freed peoples were tasked with abruptly making a new life. The main character, Vyrie, begins the story as a young girl who, during life on the Dutton plantation, finds that she must navigate her young understanding through the puzzling personal politics of slavery. The plantation owner, John Dutton, is also her father. And while she's initially allowed to play with her white half sister, Lillian, Vyrie is confused when the two become older. The two girls are forbidden to play with one another. This situation actually signals later themes about Vyrie's navigating all of these new circumstances all of the time. And she's also, at the same time, navigating other necessities of survival. In the ensuing years, Vyrie charts her way through brutalities, new owners, love, life, new phases of American history, new situations, and new physical locations. But her superpower is her endurance, and she remains intact through the entire ordeal. That's one of the things that makes Jubilee special. It's not a severance, there's not a rupture. Vyrie remains intact as a whole person the entire ordeal. Says critic Adrian Baytop, Walker allows Vyrie to pass simultaneously from slavery to freedom and from girlhood to womanhood. Thus, Walker frees her epic from the traditional male-oriented sense of the heroic, structuring her novel around Vyrie, while other characters play a supportive role to underscore her own heroism. The story continues through the Civil War as she and others struggle to keep the plantation going as their last refuge in the surrounding chaos. Most of the plantation's inhabitants flee as the South and slavery concurrently collapse. The remaining member of the Dutton family, Lillian, her sister, is utterly ill-equipped to handle the farm, so most of the burden falls on Vyrie. Soon after the Civil War ends, Vyrie has several other phases in her life, up through womanhood, and also through Reconstruction. She experiences continuing racial violence and inequality, which dramatizes the unbroken lineage of racism from slavery on. However, simultaneously, her story also depicts the enduring resistance and continuity of love and life. Walker's novel stands out in the years it was written. There simply weren't any other books like it at the time. It's meticulously researched, so while events are fictionalized, it does portray existence under slavery not previously understood at the time until Eugene Genovese's Roll Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made. But Walker's novel came 6 years earlier than that last book. It's one of the first texts outside much earlier accounts that, quote, accurately depicts what the enslaved did in bondage and later in freedom to gain control over their own lives and culture. This is at a time when most stories about the period were these sentimentalized narratives about the South. This last insight, by the way, comes from Jacqueline Miller Carmichael's article that I cite in the description. Finally, Jubilee has another distinction. It brings into the open life as a mixed race woman, which references or seems to reference an 1892 book, Iola Leroy, by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Harper's book tells the account of an octoroon woman who could pass as white, but resists the easy passage into white society. By the way, that word octoroon is an old fashioned word, and they used it for people who were 1/8 black. Passing features heavily in Jubilee, but not really as a main story. While Vyre passes for white in a few instances for safety, she deliberately chooses to identify as black even in times of danger. It's a contrast with earlier novels and stories that depict passing as a cloudier moral dilemma. This aspect in Jubilee of Vyre's life shows the hypocrisy of racial lines and the inhumanity of her father, John Dutton's, ownership and treatment of his own daughter. Jubilee received some recognition at the time, but more so than in the past. Margaret Walker's book has been welcomed as a Black literary classic, and it highlights a world and memory that evaded public perception up to 1968. Its chief innovation and perspective highlights the imperfection of prevailing historical norms, which later novels also advance in their own historical amendments. You've probably heard about this next book, so this isn't really a surprise. Kindred by Octavia Butler is on many favorite lists because it deals with a historical subject, but it has a science fiction element: time travel. This factor adds another dynamic to the past-looking narrative. It creates a layer in which main characters observe history through a literal modern perspective. So, she, the main character, Dana, witnesses all of history's sharp pains through modern day eyes, which instigates comparisons between quality of lives during slavery and eventually, in her era, the 1970s. We can, of course, debate whether some of us consider the 1970s modern, but that's for another time. Butler's time travel, therefore, calls attention to the visions through which the past is perceived, and the perception Dana, a Black woman from 1976, brings to her enslavement when she travels back to the 19th century. As the book progresses, her safety and isolation are soon disturbed. Kindred's Dana is shoved from mere observation, and she eventually becomes a participant in slavery and its history. She is exposed to its violence. The fact that she learns that she's meant to save her white ancestor Rufus brings this point all the more home, because Dana understands she is responsible for the past and involuntarily subject to its consequences. The main story is this: Dana lives in Los Angeles with her white husband in 1976. They both live with their marriage in relative isolation and are fairly removed from daily social consequences of an interracial relationship. One day, Dana is mysteriously transported to a river in the early 1800s, where she saves a young boy named Rufus Whalen. She steps back into the present, but later she's repeatedly thrown back into the past whenever her white ancestor, Rufus, when his survival is in danger. Each time she returns, she remains in the 19th century longer and longer. Rufus eventually grows and learns to be a possessive and violent slave owner, and upon her return, Dana is forced to be his slave. Meanwhile, Dana meets her other ancestor, Alice, who must eventually become Rufus's victim if Dana is to survive later. And she's compelled to make a decision on whether or not to preserve her own lineage or destroy the legacy that made her. Butler's novel is, at heart, an adventurous science fiction story that teaches readers a sneaky lesson about the proximity and the significance of history years after events have occurred. One example of this is through Dana and her husband's marriage. In the 19th century, she is under constant threat of sexual violence, which is a reminder that the basic possession of her body and her sexuality are not her own. Upon her second time travel event, when she returns to 1976, she chooses a reunion with her husband. And it's a stark and important contrast to her conditions from the past. But the fact that she has sex with Kevin, her husband, while nursing marks from a recent whipping, foreshadows the shifts that will alter the relationship in the future. Kindred is a modern classic that brings history's consequences to bear on the modern world. Through time travel, Butler collapses the distinctions between then and now. And it shows readers the persistent impact of history on our current times. Shirley Ann Williams' Dessa Rose was published 1 year before our beloved in 1986. Toni Morrison has actually mentioned this. The novel traces the life of a young, pregnant, enslaved woman named Dessa, who begins the novel in a sheriff's cellar. She's been sentenced to death for killing white men and helping lead a revolt. Other enslaved people eventually rescue her from jail, and they move her to a mysterious, isolated farm in Alabama called Sutton's Glen. The farm is in ruin, but it seems to be run by a group of escapees who keep it going. The plantation is actually owned by a white woman named Ruth Elizabeth, who the others mockingly kind of call Rufel. She equally resembles the ruin of Sutton's Glen. Dessa is initially distrustful of Rufel, but she learns about the stable arrangement between the white woman and the other black folks. Rufel waits for a husband who likely will never come back, and in return, everyone else maintains the remote farm. In exchange, the former enslaved peoples enjoy a relative freedom, an oasis. The bargain between all of them undergoes several pressures from both inside and outside the farm that threaten the thinly fragile peace between all of the inhabitants. What initially begins as a tenuous truce draws Sutton Glen together in a fight for mutual survival. In addition to its innovative representations of cooperation, the novel is also an explicit response to William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner. It features several shifting points of view in first person, which tests its ability to write and preserve Black voices amidst the potential for white dominated narratives. However, despite the threat, Dessa maintains her autonomy and capacity to tell her own story. Interestingly, the novel initially begins in the voice of a white author/journalist, and he tries to capture Dessa's story for his own book. But Dessa seemingly wrests the narration back from him when she breaks free from captivity. The story's shift reflects her self-sufficiency. The white author's initial narration is a reference to a chief complaint about William Styron's novel, wherein a white perspective distorts Nat Turner's story by, for example, depicting his lust of an angelic white woman who also lived on the plantation with him. But Desirose reclaims a black woman's voice and pointedly asserts her ability to tell her own past. Another of the book's themes, bodily independence, parallels Dessa's attempts to claim a life distinct from enslavement and oppression. The book's references to history allude to a desire not only for autonomy, but for narratives and more broadly, a past told by and through Black voices. Almost 2 decades later, Edward P. Jones published an acclaimed book that enters into conversation with its predecessors, Jubilee, Kindred, Desirose, and Beloved. Conventional overviews suggest the book is about the peculiar instances of Black slave owners, which demonstrates slavery's complicated past. But I think more so, the known world seems to be about a more general, a broader moral corruption from slavery. Here's a note that I like from Frederick Douglass. He has a quote in his narrative of the life, in which he says, "I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the Black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom." Here, Douglass refers to the gift of literacy, but even more, he understood that slavery was a structure of the mind as well as an oppression upon the body. Especially in his interaction with another character, Mrs. Auld, another person, he explains how that mindset corrupted his once kind mistress, and in a way, her prison made him feel sympathy for her. The social construct referred to in Douglass's work is what I think is at play in Jones's The Known World. It is about Black slave ownership, but in the context of the book, this seems to be a symptom of a larger story. Slavery's social ills corrupt the land and its inhabitants for generations. The narrative is mostly nonlinear, and it follows the inhabitants of a place called Manchester County. The primary focus is the lives of enslaved people on a Black-owned plantation by Henry Townsend. He is a former slave whose parents bought his freedom, and in turn, Townsend purchased 33 people. His parents were beyond disappointed. So he tries to make up with this, and he dedicates himself to become a better owner than whites. But his progress slowly undermines this ambition. It's not possible. His plantation falls prey to the same hierarchical violence that plagues other owners. After he dies at the early age of 31, the farm transfers over to his wife, who also struggles to maintain order because she refuses to use violence to coerce servitude. And in Jones's book, violence is a feature of slavery. Elsewhere in the county, others, such as a well-meaning sheriff, struggle with his own human ownership. He finds he can escape his trappings when he dreams of sexually possessing a Black girl who he simultaneously treats as a family member. As the Townsend plantation collapses, Manchester County must deal with the long-term consequences of legalized slavery. Thus, rather than reviewing slavery from a Black ownership lens, as some reviews have suggested, Jones shows how slavery is a cross-section of different power dynamics between law, class, gender, and education. The lens through which power and property relations are viewed shows how slavery's corruption persists decades and centuries after its legal undoing. As suggested by some contemporary theorists, like Nell Irvin Painter, historical events like slavery create cultural patterns that persist in the social structures we live by. Jones's novel is another classic that subverts existing historical narratives on slavery and asks readers to reconsider popular narratives about the past. The final book comes from one of my personally favorite authors. And similar to a few other selections from this list, its inclusions probably won't surprise readers. The next book is Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, and it won a Pulitzer in 2017, which was the author's first but not only awarded book. The story is about a young enslaved woman named Cora, who escapes a Georgian plantation through a fantastical but literal rail system underground railroad. The original Underground Railroad was a figurative title for the network system of helpers who ushered enslaved people to freedom up north. Whitehead literalizes this system to quickly transport his characters into different states or phases of slavery in new episodes. A killing of a young man eventually increases efforts to find the escaped Cora, and she is pursued by a brutal catcher named Ridgway. The rail system transports her from state to state, where she is eventually met by each new episode and, of course, a new trouble. More than a gimmick, the manifestation of a real railroad system underground also shows that, despite all of these modern miracles like the railroad and the semi-magical appearance of a literal underground rail system, that slavery persists and mutates, and Cora cannot escape it despite traveling these vast distances underground. Her story is one of perpetual movement and inescapability. Whitehead's iteration of the modern slave narrative writes trauma into the discourse on historically persistent tropes from slavery. He shows how these ideas make it into the bones and into the blood of a culture and remain in the foundations of historical narratives a country tells itself. The only brief respites in the book are: 1, its hope for a future but uncertain change, and 2, in one scene on what's called the Valentine Farm, this prospect is that education and intellectual community may actually forge new narratives and express new truths previously unread. These possibilities, like other moments of hope, are still vulnerable to violent bursts of oppression from peoples who view them as a threat. Whitehead's book is another classic and is sure to forward the conversation and the discourse on history in this genre. The modern enslaved narrative seeks to rewrite historical misconceptions, make connections between the present and the past, and also reform paths for new perspectives on slavery's representations. In each instance, the authors reveal that the 19th century's violent imaginations still shape modern life and fester in its undergirdments. However, Jubilee reminds us that real history remains unclaimed, Kindred utilizes science fiction to show the horror of slavery's persistent ideas and also a possibility of a reach beyond them. Dessa Rose reclaims Black female voices from historical misinformation. The known world complicates slavery's legacy, and the Underground Railroad never escapes slavery, but finds a possibility through education and uncertainty. And from these narratives, there is hope to relearn history's lessons, connect through discourse, and renew understanding of modern structures that bind and divide us. Thank you. This has been Tilting at Tomes. As always, I'm Ben.